So, John, thank you so much for being here with us today.
My pleasure, Hugo.
The next speaker is someone who's a really good friend of us. So, how you will describe him?
I would say Nigel Thurlow is a highly energetic, entrepreneurial spirit who's dedicated to helping organizations transform to delivering maximum value for their customers. He also is a lean agilist practitioner, and I believe he has customer value principles in his actual DNA.
Thank you so much, Nigel, and keep the flow.
Welcome, Nigel Thurlow.
So we'll see how we go. I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution of lean thinking. This is sort of where, for a lot of people, it started, the Toyota production system. Sakichi Toyoda and Kichiro Toyoda, the great-grandfather and grandfather of the current Mr. Toyoda, Akio Toyoda, our company president, and Eiji Toyoda and Taiichi Ono, who created the Toyota production system. This sort of gave birth to the Lean Enterprise Institute, the Lean movement, this very famous book Jim Womack, Dan Jones from MIT wrote, and then, of course, the Lean Enterprise Institute was born from their work, and I mentioned John Shook earlier today. Then a couple of guys got together about 1995 and did this thing called Scrum, which seems to look like PDCA with time boxes, so some disciplined PDCA. And then fast forward a little bit longer, and some of the colleagues of Chet that he missed out on went to somewhere near Salt Lake City in the US to Snowbird and wrote this thing called the Agile Manifesto in 2001. Coincidentally, this same year, Toyota wrote its values and principles, the Toyota Way, which was personified in this fantastic book by Jeff Leiker. It's the original internal document in Toyota. So we had these pillars of continuous improvement and respect for people. But as I started saying last year, TPS, or what a lot of people call lean nowadays, is not enough. It's no longer enough in the world we're now living in. And so I was sort of sharing this vision last year, Scrum the Toyota Way, where I was sort of describing lean as building the product right. Nobody will deny that Toyota build extremely high quality products and reliable and durable. But are we building the right product? Is not agility about building the right product? And then I sort of put this thing called Scrum in there, which in essence is an empirical planning system with a built-in customer feedback loop. So I sort of postulated you can be lean without being agile, you can be agile without being lean, and I thought, that's it. We're done. Scrum the Toyota Way. But then IBM went and spoiled it in September this month, went and spoiled it this report, which says nearly half of all chief human resource officers are saying, actually, it's not technical skills anymore, it's that matter, not this agile stuff that matters anymore. It's actually, they don't have the complex problem-solving skills, they don't know how to operate as teams, and they lack business understanding and leadership. The data's quite clear. It says digital skills gap are being addressed, but the leadership and behavioral skills are not. So then I had a thought, and I went and thought, well, maybe we should look at the evolution of lean thinking, and this is where you want your iPhones to record. This is the first time we're showing this in Europe. I showed it 2 weeks ago in Sao Paulo in Brazil. Welcome to the evolution of lean thinking, and we need my audio now, please. Welcome to the Toyota Flow System. The Toyota Flow System is not another Agile framework. It is not another scaling approach. This is a system of learning, a system of understanding. We built this on the foundation of the Toyota production system, so everything that is part of our DNA still exists. We have our philosophy, the Toyota way, which is the way we interpret TPS away from the manufacturing line. But we have created 3 new helixes. These are not pillars in the traditional sense of the typical Toyota house. These are individual strands of DNA. On their own, they are not very usable. Intertwined and combined, they create the DNA of organizations. We start with customer first in the base of the Toyota production system, and customer first flows through to the pinnacle, the outcomes, the outputs of the Toyota Flow System. And to achieve the flow of value to customers in these complex and disrupted environments we now find ourselves in, each component must be interconnected, synchronized, and embedded in an organization's function and structure. I want to talk to you a little bit about each element of this. I won't go too deeply, time will not allow. Let's look at this customer first principle. We've heard for a lot of people about value, customer value, and flow. So we started doing this in 1946. This is Kamiya-san, the first president of Toyota Motor Sales in Japan. And 1946 was an interesting time for Japan, right at the beginning of rebuilding after World War II. Yet Toyota said that we must consider the needs and the desires of the customer when determining direction and strategy. And Kamiya-san says the primary focus of the car manufacturer must always be the customer. Interestingly, this guy you may know, Edwards Deming, who spent a lot of time talking about quality in Japan around that time, and this book that he wrote, the book that was quoted in, Deming says good quality and uniform quality have no meaning except without reference to the customer's need. So quality means customer first. Peter Drucker, equally as well revered in Japan, who created management by objectives, he coined this phrase many years ago: there is only one valid definition of business purpose, and that is to create a customer. He also went on to say there are no results inside the enterprise, KPIs, function point counting, status reports, whatever. The only results you find are outside of the enterprise. In the enterprise, there are only cost centers. Your results are only measurable here where the customer is. And our friend Steve Denning, he mentioned this morning, the Copernican revolution. The reason we put Copernicus in there is the world's first astronomer, looked through a telescope and decided the Earth was no longer the center of the universe. And then, as Steve described this morning, the customer has now become the center of the universe. 30 years ago, you wouldn't have got on a plane and flown 500 miles to save $10 on a pair of shoes. But now at the click of a mouse, you do. So the customer has become the center of our universe. And indeed, nearly 200 CEOs just the other week decreed shareholder primacy is done, is finished. No longer are we focused on the shareholders. We are now focused on the stakeholders. And these were the 4 points they put in this manifesto they wrote. Delivering value to our customers is number 1. Because without this, the others cannot be supported. Or you could do it the Nokia way Everybody knows the story. Steve Jobs stands on stage in 2007, and exactly 5 years to the month, Nokia didn't exist anymore. And why? Because they wouldn't make a decision. They wouldn't change their plans, their strategy. They didn't adapt to what they could see happening in that disruptive market, and Nokia vanished. Toyota's in a disruptive market now. Elon Musk and Tesla has created that disruptive market. He's disrupting space travel with the release of Spaceship One this week. So we need to change. So in the Toyota Flow system, we were very cognizant of this, and we started by looking at our DNA. We have 3 key principles in the Toyota production system. Customer first is our cornerstone, our guiding principle. Everything we do for the customer. That determines all our strategy. Respect for humanity, because if we get customer first right, we can support our communities and humanity as a whole, because we have the money and the resources to do that. And to help us do this effectively, we eliminate all forms of waste. That's the removal of waste. And this flows through each of the helixes in this triple helix of DNA, and we'll talk about these aspects in a minute. We have continuous flow of customer value, and our primary focus in this complex and disruptive world is customer first value delivery. So let's look at this complexity. We've got the deep expert in complexity with us today. We're very fortunate, and Dave Snowden will be speaking after lunch. So we've included a few things in here, and maybe familiar to many people. The Cynefin framework is here. We won't dive too deeply into these today, but as Stephen Hawking said, at the turn of the millennium, when we started this 21st century, he says he thinks the next century will be the century of complexity. And he went on to say we've already discovered the basic laws that govern and understand all the normal situations. And in the video you saw, Wes Churchman in 1967 defined 3 types of complex problems. And sort of number 2 and number 3 are where we're mainly interested now. Complex problems that have an agreed problem but no agreed solution, type 2, and type 3, what's sometimes described as wicked problems, those which there's no consensus over the problem or the solution. And indeed, when you solve a problem, it creates another problem. These are why they're termed as wicked problems. And to help us navigate this world, we have the Cynefin framework. Now, Dave and I could debate the meaning of the word. Dave is the Welshman, and he's the expert in this word. But roughly translated to habitat, or a more English synonym for Nigel being an Englishman, would be domains. So we have these wonderful domains of complexity. And in the middle, where many of us spend our time in this disorder, trying to figure out where we actually are, we now have a framework to help us understand where we are in this complex world. And I sort of created another picture to try and help us understand this, because it's a difficult topic. So on the right, we have the Toyota production system, linear, ordered, predictable. This is systems thinking. This is where the systems thinking people are. So we're in this obvious, or what used to be called the simple domain, and in the complicated domain, many things happening, but the cause and effect well understood. Then we head over to this side, and we're into this complex, unordered, non-linear, unpredictable world. And that is a very much different world to the Toyota systems thinking world. We're in this world now where we're dealing with complexity and ambiguity and volatility, etc. So, simple comparison. On the left, the Toyota production system, linear, ordered, predictable, fixed allocation of resource. On the right, a great game both Dave and I love, the game of rugby, the English game of rugby, I hasten to add, Dave. The English game of rugby, non-linear, unordered, unpredictable, with a dynamic allocation of resources. Try and do a Gantt chart for a game of rugby or a game of football and see how that works out in Microsoft Project. Professor Haydar Ziv, Professor of Informatics at the University of California, Irving. His PhD thesis was Ziv's Law, which has become Ziv's Law, the uncertainty principle in software engineering. I'm not going to read all this, but it basically says developing software is unpredictable. You have this wonderful thing called emergent learning, and therefore a linear process is never going to be adaptable for this type of emergent process. And that brings us on to a little bit now, we're getting a little bit more advanced now. We've got these closed systems where the interactions between the subsystems are controlled as a mean of maintaining that system. This is TPS. This is linear systems thinking. But now we're getting into these sort of open systems and these adaptive self-forming open systems where interactions come from that self-organization and the functions learn, adapt, and transform to meet the challenges of that new environment. And one example of that is something called a complex adaptive system. In complex adaptive systems, systems self-organize through these dynamic interactions and these feedback mechanisms to become adaptive. So we have these emergent patterns and these emergent interactions and the way we have dynamic interactions and feedback. And I'm afraid that systems thinking and Toyota business process such as the 5 why analysis in problem solving doesn't work in this world. It doesn't function because these problems are not irreducible. You cannot reduce them back to their original state. And sometimes people say the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. So we now need different thinking to deal with this. So this leadership, we heard a lot of great speakers today talk about leadership. So let's talk about how we're looking at changing leadership models, and we purposely put these words, psychological safety, at the top of this helix. So we have to talk about how leadership are now going to function. We're in this new world where systems thinking, linear planning, and management doesn't work anymore. So complexity leadership requires what we call teams or collectives. No one person can address this. This old styles of command and control leadership will not function anymore. Leadership becomes this collective construct, no longer a sort of individual construct. And leadership becomes a shared property of all the people participating in the team, and the team becomes the leadership. So we're moving away from these traditional models of top-down command and control where the big boss tells the other bosses who tell a bunch more bosses what to do, or some sort of centralized leadership which is basically the same thing drawn in a different pattern. And we're sort of moving now into these more decentralized formats and into the world which a lot of the Agilists like, which of course is distributed leadership. But that doesn't just mean the lunatics running the asylum, everybody's off doing their own thing. And the reason we're moving this way is because hierarchy kills efficiency. This is Melvin Conway, Conway's Law, 1967. And in just a little anecdote for you, Melvin Conway didn't call it Conway's Law. Fred Brooks called it Conway's Law when he wrote The Mythical Man Month. So I'm not going to read all this out, but it basically says, you have a deep, complex hierarchy of decision-making, you'll have deep, complex systems that you build and have to maintain. And Craig's presentation made that very, very visual, excellent presentation, exactly what he's describing here. So we're now starting to develop some new leadership models, and one of my co-authors, Professor John Turner, who's here with us today, and he'll be talking to some of you tomorrow, is working hard on some new leadership models with the help of University of North Texas, where he runs the team science department. And so the team now becomes leaders. It's a team of individual leaders. And the leadership function comes from the team. So the teams are leading the organization, not the other way around. And leadership and management, of course, very different concepts. And when you get into running multiple teams, we now start to change the traditional management role into this new functional role across the boundaries of these teams. I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. So leadership must adapt. Organizations are moving to team-based systems, but not using team-based management. So we're all doing Scrum and Agile and sprints and words like points and velocity. And the management of things like status reports and meetings and waterfall project plans. And we wonder why this isn't working very well. So the command and control will prevent those sort of self-organization and this emergent outcomes. So leadership needs to be engaged, and their primary focus needs to be building an engaging vision. They also need to be building psychological safety. The andon cord in the Toyota production system is one of the metaphors for psychological safety. Anybody can stop the production line at any time, irrespective. That's several thousand workers will just stand and wait when somebody pulls the andon cord. That's psychological safety. Leadership must seek to create shared mental models. Are we all on the same level? Are we all agreeing and believing the same things? And leadership needs to enable and empower agile execution, not delegate and blame. So let's talk about this psychological safety. Kathleen O'Connor from Cornell has talked about psychological danger, which a lot of us suffer from in our organizations, the fear of admitting our mistakes, easy to blame other people, where what we really want is psychological safety. And if we don't have this, then what happens? You get the common knowledge effect. You've been in those meetings where everybody goes, oh, yeah, it's really bad. Yeah, it's really bad. And nobody really knows what's bad, but it's really bad. Because the elephant floating in the room over there, nobody's talking about. So we need to establish psychological safety. Dr. Amy Edmondson from Harvard, she's a professor novartis of Harvard University, Harvard Business School. She has written extensively, and one of her latest books, The Fearless Organization, on psychological safety. So leaders need to be setting stages, sort of understanding these shared mental models, shared expectations, shared visioning, and inviting participation, pulling the andon cord, leading from the teams. And then, of course, responding productively with positive reinforcement and making it safe to fail and fail fast, learn early, even in safety-critical environments. Now, somebody mentioned yesterday in one of the panels, Kurt Hofstede from the Netherlands and the Power Distance Index. And I've spent some time with a gentleman called David Marquette, who's ex-US Navy, and he's written a lot about intent-based leadership. And we've put leaders' intent in the Toyota flow system because the Power Distance Index is about moving the authority to where the information is. The Toyota production system andon cord is about giving the authority to the people closest to where the work is being done because they have the information. They have the best decision-making capability because they're doing the work. So we need to close the power distance index between the teams doing the work and the people who are managing the company. And Steve Denning talked yesterday briefly on the panel about the power distance index between your customer and you is closing. Automotive manufacturers will be selling cars directly in the coming years to customers. The dealership model is going to change dramatically. And that reduction of the power distance index will mean more rapid feedback, and your organizations will need to respond more rapidly. And that's also a major disruption in the way we sell products and services, not just cars. So these are things we need to be taking into account. One of the other key things you need to be building in your organizations is a learning culture, a strong learning orientation. This is the process that we have in Toyota called on-the-job development, not training within industry or on-the-job training, but on-the-job development, learning by doing. So we need to be, you know those teams that say we're too busy, we haven't got time to learn, we haven't got time to understand those technical spikes you want to do, we're too busy to do stuff, we have to do stuff. But this is what you need to build into your organizations. And then Steve said in his book, The Age of Agile, a great read, distributed leadership, including leadership at the executive levels, will become a growing, learning, adapting, living organism that is in constant flux to identify and develop new opportunities that add value for customers. So leadership's role is to add value and to enable the organization to deliver. The last 5 minutes before we go to lunch, I'll talk a little bit about team science. And if you're in the conference tomorrow, please stop by and see Professor Turner speaking. And we're talking a little bit about this. And if you come to my workshop tomorrow, we'll put a little bit of this in as well. So, a lot of words, a lot of different approaches here for team science. Let's talk about what a team is. Because doing Scrum doesn't make you a team. Hey, let's go to the room and do these things called events and activities. And we can have these roles that Craig talked about. It doesn't make you a team. The interdependency between you, if I need to work with some of you to accomplish something, this determines the need for a team. That's the context. But now we need to learn how to be a team, because a team is 2 or more people working independently, adaptively, and dynamically towards a shared and value goal. So there's your shared mental model again coming into team science. And of course, the events in a standard team life cycle, as many of you are familiar with in these agile pursuits like Scrum, planning, execution, and reflection. But teamwork is composed of a bunch of things like people's behaviors, their attitudes, their cognitions, and teamwork is very different to task work. Project management focuses on doing tasks, not how people function and work together in these dynamic organisms, these complex adaptive systems. So teams need to learn how to be a team. It's not automatic. So let's talk about task work versus teamwork. The task work is the knowledge, the skills, the abilities, the necessary to get a piece of work done, to complete a task. But teamwork is this dynamic, evolving process that changes and develops over time. This is a complex adaptive system. And teamwork is the product of all team members. The outcome of the team is the product of them all. And then we get into this team effectiveness versus performance. People talk about high-performing teams, and they've got some measure or metric for this quality or quantity or velocity or output-based measures. But what we actually want to do is we want to combine many things to measure the effectiveness of a team. So team effectiveness relates to the outcomes of performance, teamwork, and task work, a combination of these things that we can measure. And indeed, we have the formula to measure team effectiveness. This has come from the research that John has done at the university and many, many decades of research. I won't interpret that in great detail. It would take longer than the time box I have left, which is only 3 minutes, which I have to be quick because you want to eat. But you will be getting copies of this. You can take a photograph of this, and you can learn more about this over the next couple of days. And this is really important because we need to create team effectiveness training to develop those teams. We need to focus on the teamwork skills for the context that the teams are in. And then we need to make sure that the learning is focused on the right activities and content to create those teamwork skills. All the team members must be working together and trained together, and we must incorporate those briefing and debriefing activities. Scott Tannenbaum's talked about the importance of debriefing. We have some military folks in the room, and debriefing is probably the most important part of any mission that a military person will undertake. And training must be evaluated and tested for effectiveness, and of course, hopefully delivered co-located in real time. Couple of slides on measuring team performance. We need to be using behavioral markers. Behavioral markers are defining a type of behavior you want to achieve and then carefully defining that behavior so that you can measure that. And this allows us to do things like self-assessment and self-guided correction. I used a slide similar to this last year. This is where teams self-assess themselves and self-guide their improvements in this on-the-job development, continuous learning, continuous improvement culture. And this becomes incredibly important when you move into scaling and into multi-team systems. So 2 or more teams working, directly and independently towards some collective shared goal. But then teamwork is the same, but now we've got this cross-team coordination. So we're suggesting this functional role or these functional managers can become boundary spanners across these multiple teams, focused on things like impediment resolution, solving problems for the teams, and stopping that management style that says, don't bring me problems, only bring me solutions. Teams will focus on their sprint goals, of course, but now as a collective construct, they need to focus on the distal goals or the goals of the scaled group. And of course, we need a lot of ways to be able to measure this as an effectiveness formula. Now, so in my last few seconds, to get out of VUCA, this volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and to turn this acronym, which is from the military world, this VUCA world, into flow, how about we change this to value, understanding, clarity, and agility? So lean thinking has evolved into flow thinking. Toyota Flow system. Thank you very much.